Let's talk about introductions. This can be, for some people, the hardest part of the paper. Just how do you get started? Sometimes once we're finally into the paper, it can come naturally. We've organized our thoughts well. We can write an effective essay, but ultimately getting to that point can frustrate a lot of people. So we're going to walk through what the introduction does for the paper and use that to identify a few tips for getting that paper off to a good start. So instead of thinking about papers, I want you to think about your favorite story. It could be a book, it could be a movie, and ask yourself, how does that story start? What happens that draws you into that thing that you like so much? And what you're going to find when you think that question through is that good stories set the stage for what is to come effectively. And that's what an introduction does. This is all about setting up what is to come so that your reader understands what to expect. Introductions for essays provide important information that set up your paper. Think of it as that background story. Think of it as introducing a key character or introducing the setting for where that story is going to occur. Introductions, again, are all about providing important information that will set the context for your reader. So think in terms of what are the key pieces of information that I want my reader to have in mind when he or she starts reading my paper. So now let's get to the composition of the introduction. What should be included? Unfortunately, introductions are pretty straightforward. There's two key things that a good introduction needs. The first, as we just talked about briefly, is that background information. Set the stage. Let your reader know what to expect. The second key part of the introduction is the thesis statement. And there's a thesis statement video elsewhere in the course, so we're not going to dwell on the thesis in too much detail here. But for the purposes of this conversation, remember that your thesis statement is the main idea that your paper is going to develop. This is your position. This is what you're going to argue. So you state your position and you provide key areas of support. That's all you need in a good introduction. Some background information and a good thesis statement. So you might be asking, okay, that sounds simple enough, but what kind of information should I have? How do you understand what is good or what isn't good background information? And in one sense, there's no perfect answer. When you tell a story, you can introduce the story in a lot of different ways. But good introductions, in terms of the information they provide to set things up, they share a common characteristic, and that's that they provide just enough information. You don't have to share everything that's possibly relevant to what you're going to talk about in your paper. You should provide basic things that will help set up your conversation and only provide enough information that your reader is going to need to understand what is coming. Set expectations, but don't get bogged down. Think back to a friend who may have told you a story, and the friend says, I got a great story to tell you about my weekend, and the friend takes a ton of time just to get to the main point. You can probably think, okay, let's get to the story now. I've heard you start things off. I want to know what happened. Think of your introduction in the same way. You want to provide information, but you want to get to the point. So don't get bogged down in dumping a ton of detail into that first paragraph in your paper. When you're writing a paper, there's some types of information that you can generally use effectively as part of that background information. If you're writing on a specific text, a poem or a story or a play, stating the title, stating the author, stating the basic context, or some of the key themes or ideas in that text, those are all good pieces of information to provide in your introduction. Again, you don't have to cover every possible angle. You just provide the key pieces of information that will help your reader understand what you're going to talk about. And a second point follows from that guidance, and that's make sure that the information you provide is directly relevant to your thesis. Remember that your thesis is the main point of your paper overall. So if you're introducing something, you want to introduce that thesis statement, that argument. So the background information should be directly relevant to what you're going to talk about. And again, let's go back to that story with a friend. If the friend's story is about going mountain climbing, but the friend introduces the story by talking about a movie, you might kind of wonder, okay, how does this movie have anything to do with your experience mountain climbing? You want to provide information that is directly relevant to what you're going to talk about. So let's do a quick example to help you understand how this all starts to fit together. Let's say that you're writing a paper about the theme of love in Romeo and Juliet. So here are some possible relevant pieces of background information that you could provide. You could certainly mention Shakespeare. He's the author of the play. That's always fair game. If you want to provide an author's name in your introduction, great. That's a good way to let your reader know what you're going to talk about. You might talk about where Shakespeare came from or what was going on when he lived. Those kind of general cultural context pieces of information can also be really effective. In the context of writing about love, you might discuss the way love was understood in Shakespeare's England. That again is relevant, it sets the stage, but it doesn't try to cover every aspect of Shakespeare's culture. It focuses on one specific piece of information. You could also draw on general ideas about love, but of course be specific, and by that we mean make sure that you connect any general concept in background information to the thesis that you're going to develop in your paper. Again, you want to focus in that background information so that your reader understands how it is relevant to the thesis that you're ultimately going to write and develop. So think of a funnel. You want to start broad in some ways, but you want to narrow very, very quickly so that your background ultimately gets to that thesis and it's clear what the connections are across those two pieces of the introduction. Now, something that's important to think about is what you should not include as background information. Unfortunately, here too, there are a couple of helpful guidelines to keep in mind. The first thing you should not include is anything since the beginning of time or something overly broad. Remember, a paper is focused. You're talking about a specific thing. You're not going to cover understandings of love since the beginning of time. So don't start your paper that way. We'll come back to how do you start the paper here in just a second. Don't be overly broad. Be specific in setting up your paper. Don't similarly make overly broad claims about human nature. Don't bring something up that you're not ultimately going to be able to speak to in the context of your paper. Again, stay focused and stay relevant to that thesis statement. And finally, don't bring up authors or events that you're not ultimately going to talk about. This is the friend talking about the movie when the story is about mountain climbing. Make sure that your information in your introduction is directly relevant to what you're going to talk about. So let's step back again and remember the thesis statement for just a second, because we're going to transition into thesis statements here. A thesis statement sets a position, the X, as I like to call it. That's what you believe. That's the point of your paper. That's what you're going to argue. So Shakespeare thinks that love is the key to understanding human nature. That's a statement of belief. That's an X. And then you provide the key reasons for that position as the second part of your thesis. So perhaps Shakespeare believes this about love because in Romeo and Juliet, he uses both familial love and friendship love to undermine the happiness of characters. Whatever your thesis statement may be, these are the two key components, the position and the reasons for that position. So let's start to piece some of this together in a bit more detail. After you've drafted your introduction, you want to ask a basic question. Is the thesis statement that follows the formula we just talked about directly relevant, or does it relate directly to the background information you have provided? There should be an obvious connection. And it's very simple to think that through. You just ask yourself, okay, how does my background information relate to my thesis statement? If you can't answer that question, based on what you have written, your reader's not going to be able to answer that question. So you want to work on those connections. Maybe provide more specific information, maybe remove information, but make sure that connection is clear. And obviously, if the answer is no, or you can't think of a clear answer to that question, you should remove that background information. Make sure those connections are clear, because if you can't find them, your reader won't be able to find them. So now let's talk about one of the hardest things in writing a paper, and that's the elusive first sentence. How do you get the paper started? When you're looking at that blank screen, what's the first thing you should do to get your paper going? And what I want to encourage you to remember is that you don't have to get the perfect line right away. That's not always going to happen. Sometimes it never happens. If you're feeling stuck, step back and do two specific things to get your thesis statement and introduction going. The first is just write one sentence about your topic. It can be any sentence that's relevant to the question that you're trying to answer. And then two, write that thesis statement. Go back to that formula we just discussed a couple slides ago. State your answer, provide the basic reasons for that answer. If you could do these two things, you're going to be well on your way to doing your job as far as writing a good introduction. And obviously, once you've put these two sentences to paper, you've typed them up, stop and ask that question. Is there a clear connection between these two sentences? If the answer to that is yes, you've got the framework for a good introduction. You just need to fill out that background information. So let's provide some other tips for writing a good introductory paragraph. As we just said, you don't have to have the perfect opening line. And if you're ever really, really stuck and you just want to get unstuck, you can start with your thesis statement. There's nothing wrong with that. You don't have to put your thesis as the last sentence of the introductory paragraph. Start with your position because that's clear and it's to the point. You would then fill in the background information afterwards. Along those lines, your thesis could be any sentence in the introduction. Again, it doesn't have to exist in a specific place. What the thesis needs to do is answer the question and provide the key reasons for that thesis statement. You can put it wherever you want and then mold your background information around the thesis statement to draw your reader in and set up your conversation. And just as a general length requirement, I always encourage students to think about an introduction as being between 3 and 7 sentences long. Again, you want to provide some information, you want to provide some context, but you want to get to the point. And if your thesis statement is going to be 1 or even 2 sentences, that gives you a sense of how you should provide background information in terms of numbers of additional sentences. So, how do you write a good introduction? Start with relevant background information, provide a clear thesis statement, make sure that those two things relate clearly, and make sure that you are focused. Keep that introduction short and sweet. Raise the paper's key topic in that thesis, provide your readers with some context and the background information, and your paper is going to be off to a great start. So hopefully that was helpful in thinking through how you can get started with this process of writing a paper. Once you get your head around what an introduction is supposed to do, hopefully this will start to feel easier. If you need more help on the thesis statement, there is a video that deals with thesis statements specifically elsewhere in the course. And in the meantime, good luck with those papers, and we'll look forward to talking more about other aspects of academic writing elsewhere in this course.